live there, go live here. All right, looks like we're live on YouTube. Go live on Facebook as well. To get that started. Okay, go live here. And we'll start the podcast recording. All right, we have the podcast recording, and I think we're all set. All right, hey everybody. It's our third part of conversation around the Mexican-American War.
Yes, this is the very irregular history podcast that we do. Standard disclaimers, we're not professionals. We're just two friends talking about stuff. Don't cite anything we said academically. Just enjoy it, and hopefully, if anything of this interests you, read for yourself and, maybe learn something. Maybe fact check us. Do
Tom,
whatever you like to do.
We're incredibly knowledgeable about
We are
this.
incredibly knowledgeable, but, just in case.
Right. Maybe a little bit of an amateur effort here, I suppose.
It's possible, but we have been enjoying reading about a lot of things here. I mean, this is an interesting topic, not only for the history of it, but also there's so many issues that come up in American history that are covered here. A lot of personalities that are also important in other parts of 19th century American history, and really issues that still come up today. And that's why we've really enjoyed this. For this one, I think we're going to get into a couple of battles that Jason has really researched. So we talked about, I believe, the first battle last time.
Right. So the quick recap would be U.S. Army goes down to Texas, right? After Texas has joined the Union,
yes,
to sort of enforce territorial control of what the U.S. / Texas said it controlled, right? So Zach Taylor is the commanding general over the forces down there. They, along the border, win a couple of battles, Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, pretty decisively.
Yes.
So, the next stages of this are kind of continuing to pursue the war into northern Mexico. And let's see, I'm going to my notes here. So let's see, you had, well, there's other things going on here too, right? There's a campaign that's starting to go out west, which I don't think we're going to talk that today. We're just talking mostly the battles of Monterrey and what's the other one? Buena Vista.
Yeah, we're still in northern Mexico, pretty much. We haven't gotten into any of the basically invasions by sea yet, right?
Right. This is all just kind of that, right? That northern campaign into North Mexico,
which was still led by General Taylor.
Yes,
we will talk about General Scott later. That we have been researching him, very interesting figure. But right now, this is still General Taylor's troops, and the next battle we're talking about is the Battle of Monterrey, right?
Yes. So the year is still 1846.
Yes.
And now we're getting into the latter part of the year, but so after Resaca de la Palma, you have sort of another consolidation of forces, what's going to advance into northern Mexico, and so 3,200 regulars and 3,000 volunteers, so about 6,000 troops are what's taken forward. They had a lot of logistical issues with trying to, it's like, okay, how many troops can we actually take with us and sustain logistically? So I guess 6,200 was about the right amount. And then, so they're starting to advance into northern Mexico. And then also around this time, you have this Paredes, if I'm saying his name correctly. He was like um, the acting president
Sure.
in Mexico.
The Mexican political situation and who was in charge was very in flux during this time. But Paredes was, again, our Spanish might not be great.
True.
But yeah, he was in charge at this time, and he was also a general leading a.
Well, what you have is you
Okay.
have Ampadilla.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
Scratch that previous thing I said. Okay.
Right. It's okay. So right, Paredes is kind of going to be bowing out
Yes.
of the scene in terms of like Mexican leadership, and then
Yes.
we're going to have Santa Anna.
Santa Anna's coming back.
He's going to be back in the mix, but he's not back in the mix yet. At this point in time, it's this guy Ampadilla. So he's going to be the person who's contesting Taylor at Monterrey.
Yeah.
And he's got about 7,000 regulars and 3,000, they call them rancheros.
Sure.
So about 10,000 Mexicans against about 6,000 Americans around Monterrey.
So in terms of sheer, people, Mexico looks like they're in good shape here, right, for these particular battles, you would think.
A lot of these battles are interesting, right?
Yeah,
because, right, you have a numerical advantage of the Mexicans over the Americans.
You have the civilian population is on the side of the Mexicans.
Yes. Right. So it's kind of interesting, right?
Yeah.
Like you could contrast this whole campaign a little bit with, say, I don't know, we'll say Vietnam, okay,
Sure.
where it's like, okay, the loyalty of the local population, like how important is that to a military outcome, at least? And here, throughout this podcast, I think we'll find that it's often not that important.
No.
It's not like the lesson of Vietnam of like, you got to have that local population swayed.
I mean, this is a time where like technology and kind of the professionalization of the military really made a difference, right?
Yes. Yeah. Technological advantage. Yeah. Discipline of the forces, leadership of the forces, logistical sophistication, all those things will matter.
Those things might not be outcome determinative in every war, but they were big factors here.
Yes. So a few things about Monterrey. So one thing that's kind of interesting about the battle is, I guess, Taylor splits up his forces. You have General Worth.
Yes.
So, if you talk about Dallas, Fort Worth, I think this is the guy.
Yeah.
General Worth, he goes to the
Worth
west.
County, Iowa, right?
Worth County, Iowa. Worth goes to the west of the city, and then Taylor's got his other forces going, more kind of directly at the city. I just have a few different notes here. Like,
sure.
One thing that's kind of interesting is Jefferson Davis led an assault with the Mississippi Volunteers. So I think that's always really interesting to think about, like, the future, president of the Confederacy is leading an assault of soldiers from Mississippi, but for the United States, for the United States against Mexico in this war.
No, one thing about this war is a lot of the names ended up fighting in the Civil War, and are the big names of the Civil War were presidents of the United States, were, important people. Grant, Lee, all these. Pillow, I think. Jackson was down here. Is that?
I don't know that he's here. He's definitely going to be in the East later on, I think, with like Veracruz.
Yes,
and stuff
maybe not in this battle, but basically most of your Civil War people of prominence were down here fighting, obviously, on the same side for America. And, the training they got in these battles was obviously quite important for what went on in the Civil War, and also that, their varying views about politics and military strategy and all these things were shaped by this in ways that are really interesting, I think.
Yeah, like another leader from maybe it was the past battles, but I think he was at this one too, was Braxton Bragg. It was like a captain of artillery. And then George Meade was in this group also, lieutenant at the time, George Meade. So a lot of leaders for sure from the Civil War. So General Worth goes to the west of the city. There's some fighting over there. They have maybe like a dozen casualties to like 100 Mexican casualties. So that area is pretty lopsided. But overall, I guess this is on September 21st. It was a pretty rough day for the Americans, pretty bad day. They had like 394 casualties overall. And a lot of that is because this particular Battle of Monterrey is a little bit more urban warfare. It's a little more house to house fighting. Um, the Americans, they eventually, they adapt to it a little bit. They're like, knocking over like walls between buildings and stuff like that. But the urban warfare, even in that area, definitely is negating some of their, advantages in just straight linear warfare.
Sure. Just in general, what are some of the unique difficulties of urban warfare, do you think? I mean, obviously things have changed, but probably a lot of things are not that different.
Yeah, I mean, I think right. It's always the case that like any army that has some kind of advantage with what I'll call linear warfare, which is, basically like fighting out in an open plain, where you've got ranged weaponry advantages, whether that's technological advantages of the weaponry, whether that's the way that they're employed,
Sure.
whether that's the way that you tactically execute your game plan. All of that can be negated in these urban warfare environments for sure, where it's, shorter range combat, it's more house to house, individual on individual combat. And right, that's pretty much been the case ever since, I don't know, probably since firearms became a big deal, I suppose.
Ever since you don't know what's behind that door, and they might have a cannon, right?
Yeah, I mean, it probably could go back even, I suppose, into like ancient fighting or Middle Ages fighting, where it's like, our units of archers are not, being employed in the way that we expected to employ them. So, right, urban warfare has kind of been a problem forever for armies that have a distinct advantage in an open fighting environment.
And maybe an invading army as we were.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So so Monterrey actually is not as easy a battle as those earlier battles were for the army. They still are, the casualty ratios are still favorable, but not as skewed as those early conflicts.
We are taking significant casualties, whereas previously we weren't really.
Right. Pretty much those early battles were just a wash, right? And this is like a little bit more of a, 2-to-1 kind of thing. There was some moment though, basically the Americans have too many forces there. They're still too effective to where the Mexicans are really wanting to keep fighting. So there's some like little armistice moment there where Taylor says, okay, you guys can clear out. And then I know like Polk was not really happy with that there was like this little respite that was, given to the Mexicans to leave.
Yeah. The politics here are always interesting. I mean, Polk didn't seem to get along with any of the major generals. There's different. One thing to preview in the future here are that the two like most important generals were both either the nominee of the Whig Party or the actual president.
Right. Yeah, because these generals are Whigs, and then Polk is a Democrat. Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's just political intrigue and just the ambition of powerful men at this time as men is always a really interesting thing, and how this plays into the wars. And you, of course, also have to remember at this time, the president and the secretary of war were thousands of miles away, right?
Right.
So what they're hearing about these things is months later. So,
Right. Yeah. I would have to like go back and actually look at the specific dates because, right. It's like, well, how long were you in this stage of an armistice or whatever, like how much time went by for Polk to even get word of this and then to like relay his displeasure or, the new direction that he wants taken, given all the communications delays.
And of course, politicians always, want to look like they're on top of things. If something goes wrong, they want to look like they're the ones who are in charge of fixing it, and they are fixing it. And if there's someone else to blame, then that's great. And this is true of wars, then and now. And it's definitely true then.
Yeah, the real-time communications now are so different, right? Where back then you would have had that battlefield commander with more autonomy to pursue an objective.
Somebody going back on a horse, right? With
Yeah.
The reports of what happened, and
Right. It's the fastest horse I've got,
yes,
or send your fastest ship or whatever. If you're,
I don't think we had telegrams at this point yet, did we? Or
I don't think so. Yeah, I don't.
yeah,
I'm not yet. I think that's more like Civil
yeah, Civil
War
War
era. Yeah. There's big advancements with communication, right, in the Crimean War and
Yes,
the U.S. Civil War for sure.
because remember we're in 1846. Civil War started about 15 years later.
Yeah.
Yeah, technology had changed a lot by that time. You have better communications. You have the beginning of trains, right? Which,
Yeah. Yeah, I'll even mention that yeah, this conflict, like when you think about like what these battles look like, and if you see paintings of them or pictures of them, it is definitely like it looks Napoleonic.
yes,
It's like the uniforms are fancy. It's flintlock,
yeah,
musket weaponry primarily. The artillery, we do have this, flying artillery being used, to the significant advantage of the Americans, but it's like, the Mexican artillery is pretty much
yeah,
round shot. The Americans are making more use of, I suppose, canister and grape shot. More effective with that. I know they have explosive shells.
yeah,
Also, they said that's a marked advantage of the Americans with the ordnance available. But overall, it
yeah.
looks like Napoleonic warfare. You've got Mexican lancers are often referred to, that sort of thing.
And
So,
we're still at a time where everything has to be transported by horses, and
yep,
you have the transport company that's doing that, and you have
right,
bring along the cooks and everything, and the
right,
people who provide shelter and everything for the troops, and all this has to move along very slowly.
yeah, right.
And
I mean, you have like maybe some of those steamer.
yes,
From a naval perspective, you got some steamships going on.
yes, like, and we'll get into the naval stuff. There was significant advancements in naval kind of ground invasion, I'd say, from the sea in this war, but not yet. We're not there yet.
Right. So anyway, I mean, getting back to, I guess, the battles. So Monterrey is an American victory. The Mexican forces fall back, and then we pivot back to Mr. Santa Anna.
Yes.
So Santa Anna has come back into Mexico. He was off in Cuba, which I think was Spanish territory at the time. But he's returned, and basically he starts raising an army to go counterattack against the Americans. And it's kind of an interesting thing. There's a few different things I wanted to mention about this. So one thing is certain provinces, especially in the north, didn't want to furnish him with many troops because they were actually like fighting Native Americans in different areas.
Sure.
So I just think that's kind of intriguing that it's, I would think about that as more of a U.S. Army problem or westward expansion of America problem. So it's kind of interesting to hear that, like, well, no, in Mexico, they had some kinds of dynamics that were not that different.
Yes, of course, in Mexico, you have states just like you have here, and things were more decentralized then. So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, right. You have certain northern provinces like, we can't help you. We have our own problems here. Santa Anna was funding a lot of the army via loans secured by church property.
Sure.
So there's a lot of, Catholic Church interaction with the state in Mexico.
And there's always there's always conflict. I mean, the church is often politically, affiliated with one side or the other, and then there's resentment of that. Yeah. And, I believe Santa Anna exploited the resentment somewhat. And
yes. So anyway, I mean, that's just kind of an interesting thing. And then in terms of the quantity of troops, he actually raises over 20,000 soldiers at San Luis Potosi, was, I guess, kind of their concentration point. So they proceed, north to try to strike back. And it's a pretty significant march that they go on. I know that, they're really pushing to get north to counter the Americans, and they have quite a few deserters in that process. There's not great like supply of water and that sort of thing. So think by the time they actually get there to try to fight, they have more like about 15,000 men available.
I mean, this was a thing in like pre-professionalized armies, right? I mean, it's still a thing in warfare today, but in these days, if you're not feeding the troops, if you're not, or if they're just in a bad situation, you always run the risk of them just going home, right?
Yep. Right, absolutely. Right. You got a little less control over the
Yeah.
whereabouts of everybody.
Yes.
And right. Let's see. There's some interesting things going on here too at this time. Like, okay, Santa Anna's moving north. You've got the Americans trying to take Tampico, which that's kind of interesting too, because like the garrison of Tampico has been like completely removed.
Sure.
So Santa Anna is really pulling troops from all over
Yeah.
to try to muster enough forces to go against the Americans in the north. So yeah, Taylor had been moving with like a brigade to Tampico, but then I think they get word. So even like scouting and
Yeah.
just awareness of your enemy's movements is a big deal, because they get enough advance notice that they're like, okay, we got to start heading back, because this large Mexican force is heading north against us. And let's see. Yeah, about 15,000 of those 20,000 make it on the Mexican side to combat the Americans. Just one other funny note about, I guess, kind of the ragtag group of Americans with this. I know that there was some volunteer who like would not salute some general.
Yeah.
And it's just like, by God, I'm not going to do it. Like, so it's, a lot of that, I don't know, kind of cagey American Western kind of cliche spirit of, very independent, autonomous volunteers.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff would still come together, and like the army had become more professional than it was in like War of 1812, certainly. I mean, and General Scott had a lot to do with that. General Taylor had a lot to do with that. They're more professional, but it's still just a lot of volunteers, a lot of people who were just, working on farms somewhere in America. And they come down here and, you try to exert control, but that's not always easy.
Yeah, this conflict really feels like a mix of those things where it's like, maybe half of them are, they're professionals. You've got the West Point officers, leading the regulars. And then, you've got, I'm a farmer from Tennessee and I'm here to try to fight for the country. So, anyway, so this leads into the Battle of Buena Vista. And let's see. So you would have I said 15,000 Mexicans, and there was about 4,750 Americans with about 18 artillery pieces. And, it's an interesting battle. There's the Mexican attack is pretty fierce. They attack on many fronts. They do push the Americans back to some degree in a number of areas. I know that, let's see, once again, Jefferson Davis fought really effectively with the Mississippi troops. They really held the ground that they were assigned to quite effectively. What Hardin was killed from Illinois. That's some note I have here. I'm not sure if I made mention of that just because it was, maybe I thought of like the town of Hardin or something.
Sure. Yeah. A lot of, again, there's a lot of Hardin counties out there. If you're
county, maybe
if you're from any Midwestern state, a lot of these names will be familiar if you're a geography buff like me. Like there's Taylor County in Iowa. There's Taylor County and Scott County, where I'm from, Quad Cities.
I was just up in Mason City, Clear Lake area in northern Iowa, and that was Cerro Gordo.
Yes,
and that's another upcoming battle. So yeah, it's all over.
And this battle is also Iowa County, Buena Vista, which Iowans pronounce it not Spanishly. But we have several things like that, like Madrid, Iowa. But all these things, or well, not Madrid, but Buena Vista, Cerro Gordo, these are named after, actual battles. Palo Alto as well, county.
Yes. Yeah, a lot of connections between this conflict and our
Because
state of Iowa.
this
Yeah.
was going on right around when Iowa was being formed. So and I believe the state was entered into the Union in 1846, right when this was happening. So
Yeah.
this was the news at that time. So
Yeah.
And that's why we think these names are interesting, even if they might not have other historical significance.
Yeah. So just a few other notes here. So this battle, right? You had much more skewed numerical advantage, right? You had like 3-1 on the side of the Mexicans, and so they do press the Americans a lot harder. Like in Taylor's army, they ended up with about 1,500 deserters and 673 casualties. So if you figure out of 4,700 troops there, I mean, that would be a lot. You would have lost, half of your forces if my back of napkin math is correct. So the Mexicans, however, they had about 1,800 casualties. So actual casualties, almost 3 times as many, plus a few hundred captured. So, once again, the casualty ratio is pretty skewed. I know that grape shot was pretty effective with the American artillery. And so, for those of you who don't know grape shot, that is basically, lots of small fragments of either like iron balls or other fragmentary pieces of typically metal that are shot out of an artillery piece, almost kind of like in a shotgun kind of style. So obviously it's only effective at shorter range, but it is obviously much more effective at short range than just a cannonball is.
So it's another case where the Americans had a significant advantage in terms of the weaponry being used, the ammunition, if you will. And this was probably something that was significant for the outcome of this battle.
I think so, yeah. And one other thing that's kind of interesting is there will be points at which, the Americans will really go on the offensive, even in that battle. And that's kind of an interesting thing about this whole campaign is, wow, you're outnumbered, 2-1, outnumbered 3-1, attack. It's just doctrinally, it's not really like any kind of modern doctrine where, typically if you're going on the attack, you want to outnumber the opponent by, orders of magnitude, or at least by, 2-1, 3-1, something like that. If you want to have a reasonable chance of success. And that's just not the case here. This is like,
wasn't that like General Powell's thing, overwhelming force kind of?
Absolutely.
And that's what any currently trained officer would do with, if asked to prepare a battle plan. Overwhelming force would be pretty high up there in terms of what you'd want, right?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, if you look at, a lot of like 20th century counterinsurgency rules of thumb, it's like, you talk about having pretty good, troop to population ratios. And I mean, it's just interesting here that at this juncture in history that really wasn't the case. And again, whether that's technological advantage, whether that's, I think a lot of it's tactical advantage and organization, your ability to mass forces at a point of attack and be effective, with probably, small arms fire as well. Obviously it worked. So
it's just like a superior organization, the superior battle plan, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's a combination of everything, right? Leadership. And then, another thing here too, in the defense of the Mexicans that weren't as successful with their pursuit of this attack is, again, they had gone across the desert here for, I think, a number of days with poor supply. And so I know that they probably arrived at this battlefield in largely like a state of exhaustion.
Yeah.
So, ultimately that ends up resulting, at least in part, in some of the rationale for the withdrawal of the Mexicans after like this one day of fighting, really. So I know that they said that Taylor was expecting that that battle would persist, that it would continue on for additional days, and that was not the case. The Mexicans withdrew. Um, I had seen also that some of that might have been Santa Anna thinking that there was some like risk of a coup or some kind of turmoil back in the capital.
Yeah, I mean, that's one advantage that America had, I guess, relative political stability. Obviously there was a lot of political rivalries and stuff, but at this time the government was stable. There was no one trying to overthrow it. Obviously, the government got a lot more unstable really fast, but at this time,
Right.
you had everybody behind the commander in chief, whereas the Mexican situation was very much in flux. And that makes
Definitely.
it, if your political leadership is in flux, that makes it harder to, you know, plan a defense of your country, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. Yeah. So it's interesting. This was kind of the end of, I think, this phase
Yeah,
of conflict. This kind of northern campaign into Mexico. This Buena Vista victory, could have turned out differently,
yeah,
really.
yeah,
Under if you tweak the circumstances just a little bit, if the Mexicans are a little better supplied, maybe if they had just a little more troop strength, if instead of 15,000, if they did show up with
yeah.
closer to the 20,000, maybe then you have another brigade or just enough overall troop strength to actually overwhelm some different pieces of the American defense. Um,
You'd say this is one of the real inflection points you might save the war, where if something went a little bit differently, that a lot of things might have changed.
I think so, right?
Yeah,
Because it's like the Americans, even though they're doing well with their
yeah,
with their discipline, with their leadership, with their logistics, their weaponry. There's only so many of them,
yeah,
So right, if you could have had a situation where that could have actually been a more of a stalemate,
yeah,
something like that. If they lost enough troop strength relative to the Mexicans in a battle like this, you have to wonder, right, if that could have politically had
yeah.
an
It's
impact as well.
not like there's necessarily a lot more available, right? And
Yeah.
you're getting into like a draft situation where that's not popular everywhere, and that might not go well. So,
Right, and you're getting a ways into the
yes,
interior of Mexico here, right? Now,
yes,
this is not now like the successful occupation of Texan territory. Now
yeah.
you're well south of there. You don't have, territorial aspiration that south, so
We have to remember the supply chain stuff. You have to,
that too.
keep all the food and all the everything going down there from America.
Yeah,
And the harder you get in there, the harder that gets. Of course, you can live off the land a little bit, but
a little bit. But yeah, so this phase is going to kind of uh, wrap to a degree, at
yes,
least here with Taylor, and you're going to have it's going to start to become more of a President Polk working with Winfield Scott
yes,
on the pursuit of other objectives here, which
yeah,
we'll start talking about in the future, I'm sure.
yeah, yeah.
So, all right. If you enjoyed this show, certainly feel free to leave us comments on YouTube and stay tuned for more
Yes.
episodes about the Mexican American War here.
More exciting stuff. Thank you everybody for watching.